Three of the most famous physicists alive declared war on philosophy. Stephen Hawking in 2010, philosophy is dead. Lawrence Krauss compared philosophers to the punchline of an old joke. Those who can't do, teach, and those who can't teach, philosophy. Neil deGrasse Tyson warns students that philosophy can really mess you up, that philosophers get so distracted by deep questions they can't even cross the street, while scientists move forward, leave them behind, get actual work done. This wasn't casual dismissal. Hawking wrote it in best-selling books. Krauss said it in interviews, called a philosopher of physics moronic for criticizing him. Tyson said it on podcasts with millions of listeners. The message? Philosophy had nothing left to offer. Physics had moved into territory that used to belong to philosophers. Questions about the origin of everything, the nature of reality, why there's something rather than nothing, and physics had won. Science progresses, philosophy doesn't. That was the line. But then something strange happens. Watch what occurs the moment these physicists try to answer the deepest questions. Where did the universe come from? Why do the laws of physics exist? What should we do with scientific knowledge? The very act of addressing these questions pulls them into exactly what they claimed was dead. Not by accident, not occasionally, inevitably. Every attempt to explain the origin of the cosmos, every claim about what science should study, every argument about why their work mattered more than other fields, it becomes philosophy, just unacknowledged, just unexamined. This isn't about taking sides, it's about watching a specific kind of contradiction unfold, and what that contradiction reveals about the questions that refuse to stay buried. Consider what they actually said. The specifics matter here. Hawking opened the grand design with this: philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Not just that philosophers were slow, that they'd become irrelevant, that physics had picked up the torch and left them in darkness. The same book tackled what he called the ultimate questions of life: why we exist, why the universe exists, why anything exists at all. Physics, he argued, had solved them, or was about to. Lawrence Krauss, in 2012, published A Universe from Nothing, claiming to answer the ancient question, why is there something rather than nothing? When David Albert, a philosophy of physics who also holds a PhD in theoretical physics, wrote a critical review, Krauss dismissed him, called him moronic, said philosophers feel threatened because science progresses and philosophy doesn't. Here's what Krauss argued. The universe arose from quantum fields fluctuating in empty space. This was nothing giving rise to something. Albert's response was simple. Quantum fields aren't nothing. They're something. They have properties, follow laws, exist in space-time. So where did they come from? Why do they have the specific properties they have? Why those laws and not others? Notice what kind of questions these are. They can't be answered by experiment or observation. They're questions about the preconditions for physics itself. And Tyson? On a podcast in 2014, he said philosophy could mess you up, that it led to pointless delay in your progress, that when he encounters someone thinking philosophically, his response is, "I'm moving on, I'm leaving you behind." The stance was clear, confident, final. Now watch what happens when they try to move forward. Hawking's explanation for why the universe exists relied on the no-boundary proposal, the idea that at the very beginning, time becomes indistinguishable from space, that asking what came before the Big Bang is like asking what's south of the South Pole, meaningless. It's an elegant idea, But notice what's happening. This is a claim about the nature of time itself, about what kinds of questions make sense to ask, about the boundaries of meaningful inquiry. This is metaphysics, questions about the fundamental nature of reality. It's epistemology, questions about what we can know and how we can know it. It's exactly the kind of conceptual analysis that defines philosophical work. It remains philosophy, whether acknowledged or not. Krauss's situation reveals something even more striking. When pressed on where the laws of quantum mechanics came from, he eventually said, "I don't ever claim to resolve that infinite regress of why. As far as I'm concerned, it's turtles all the way down." Turtles all the way down. The old image, an infinite stack of turtles holding up the world, each turtle standing on another turtle forever. It's a reference to one of philosophy's oldest problems, the infinite regress of causation, whether explanation has to stop somewhere or continues forever, whether there can be a first cause or if every cause requires a prior cause. Krauss was engaging with this problem while insisting the field that studies this problem was useless. The physicist George Ellis pointed this out explicitly. Ellis co-wrote a landmark cosmology text with Hawking decades earlier. He noted that Krauss hadn't addressed the fundamental questions. Why do the laws of physics exist? Why do they have the form they have? In what kind of manifestation did they exist before the universe existed? These aren't beside the point, they are the point. And they can't be answered by physics alone because they're questions about the preconditions for physics to work at all. The pattern becomes visible. Consider what's required to ask, where did the universe come from? You need assumptions about causation, whether everything needs a cause, what counts as a cause, whether cause and effect applies at the origin of everything. You need assumptions about time, whether before makes sense at the beginning, about existence, what it means for something to be real. That's metaphysics, the study of the fundamental nature of reality. Or take the claim, we should fund space exploration. This requires value judgments about what matters, what's worth pursuing, what's good for humanity, what we owe to future generations. That's ethics, the study of what we ought to do. Or consider science is the only way to truth. To defend this, you'd need to step outside science and make an argument about epistemology, about what counts as knowledge, what methods are reliable, why empirical observation trumps other ways of knowing. That's philosophy of knowledge. And the declaration, philosophy is dead itself, that's a philosophical claim about the nature of different kinds of inquiry, about what's productive and what isn't, about how we should think about thinking. The contradiction isn't personal, it's structural. Physics can tell us what exists and how it behaves. It can measure, predict, test. It's extraordinary at what it does. But physics can't tell us what we ought to do with that knowledge. It can't explain why the laws of physics have the form they do rather than some other form. It can't justify its own methodology or defend its own importance. The moment those questions arise, the boundary has been crossed. Einstein saw this clearly. He said, studying the history and philosophy of science provides an independence from the prejudices of his generation from which most scientists suffer. He called this independence the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or specialist and a real seeker after truth. Not physicist versus philosopher, but someone trapped in the assumptions of their time versus someone who can see beyond them. So what's revealing itself here? One reading, these physicists genuinely believe philosophy is useless, and they're simply inconsistent. They slip into philosophical thinking without noticing. But there's another way to see this. Maybe the frustration wasn't entirely unfounded. Maybe something in academic philosophy had drifted away from the questions that matter, became too insular, too focused on analyzing the implications of discoveries without contributing to discoveries. too comfortable with complexity for its own sake. That frustration might point to something real, but the response, declaring the entire enterprise dead, reveals a particular kind of intellectual stance. There's a specific impatience visible here, a sense that questions should lead to answers quickly, that if something doesn't produce measurable results, it's not worth doing, that moving forward matters more than understanding where you're going. Tyson's framing captures this. Philosophers can't even cross the street because they're caught up in questions, while scientists move forward. But consider what this misses. Some questions don't have the kind of answers that let you move forward. They're not problems to solve and set aside. They're tensions to hold, paradoxes to inhabit. Why does anything exist rather than nothing? Physics can't answer this because any physical explanation presupposes existence, matter, energy, laws, space-time, something. The question asks about the precondition for all of that. What should we do with scientific knowledge? Science can't answer this because science describes what is, not what ought to be. The gap between description and prescription isn't a gap more science can close. How do we know what we know? No single discipline can answer this from within itself because every discipline operates on assumptions about knowledge that have to be examined from outside. These aren't obstacles to progress. They're the questions that reveal what we're actually doing when we claim to know something. And they persist, regardless of whether anyone acknowledges them.
The deepest irony isn't that physicists engaged in philosophy while dismissing it. It's that the act of dismissing philosophy is itself a philosophical position. It's a claim about what matters, about what kinds of questions deserve attention, about the hierarchy of different ways of thinking, about what progress means and whether it's always good. You can't escape making philosophical assumptions. The only choice is whether to examine them. When Hawking said philosophy is dead, he was making an argument about the relationship between different forms of inquiry. When Krauss said philosophy doesn't progress, he was working from a particular definition of progress, one that privileges empirical discovery over conceptual clarity. When Tyson said philosophy delays progress, he was asserting that moving forward matters more than understanding direction. These are all philosophical stances. And perhaps that's what becomes visible here. Not that these scientists were hypocrites, not that physics is inferior to philosophy or philosophy to physics, but that the boundaries between different kinds of thinking are more permeable than the categories suggest. The most fundamental questions about existence, meaning, value, knowledge don't belong to any single discipline. They emerge wherever human beings think carefully about anything. Call it philosophy, call it physics. Insist one is alive and the other dead. The questions remain. They remain because they're built into the structure of inquiry itself. Because every attempt to understand requires assumptions that can't be proven from within that understanding. Because answering one question opens three more beneath it. Maybe the response isn't to declare victory for one approach over another. Maybe it's to notice what happens when brilliant minds try to escape philosophical questions by answering them, when they declare the death of philosophy by making philosophical arguments, when they move forward without examining what forward means. Here's what lingers. If the act of rejecting philosophy is itself philosophical, what else are we doing philosophically without noticing? What assumptions are operating in the background of our certainties? What questions are we answering without realizing we're answering them? The physicists declared philosophy dead, but philosophy kept asking, what did you mean by dead? What counts as progress? Why should we believe you? And in trying to answer, they found themselves exactly where they said they'd never go.